one of the most complex relationships the United States has is with Russia. In the 30 years since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's a relationship which has seen its ups and downs. Last April, we had Angela Stent here from Georgetown, and she talked about her book, The Limits of Partnership. And she described this interesting pattern where for the Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama administrations, in the first term, you had a fairly positive trend in U.S. Russia relations, but it all came undone in the second term. Now, the Trump administration hasn't quite continued that pattern, but you still have a relationship where I think it would be fair to say that it's at one of the lowest points, if not the lowest point, since the end of the Cold War. And it's an agenda which has lots of difficult issues. Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela, Libya, arms control questions, issues of interference in domestic affairs. And even on, I think, those questions where cooperation, there's a coincidence of American and Russian interests, cooperation sometimes is not as easy as it might otherwise be. So I'm delighted that we have Christopher Robinson here to talk to us today. He's a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. And among other things, he has charge of Russia, or responsibility for Russia, or he oversees policy on Russia. He has nearly 25 years as a career foreign service officer. Before his current position, he was the Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the American Embassy in Moscow. Before that, Deputy Director of the Russia Desk, so he knows a lot about what he's about to speak. Other assignments, he was the Counselor for Political Affairs at the U.S. Mission to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where I've just learned that he helped design the agreement that had the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission established in Ukraine in 2014. And also served in Iraq, Belarus, Canada, and Nicaragua. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Robinson.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Is it okay if I sit? Can you all see me and hear me all right? If I stand, then you'll see me even less. And I want to make it informal, and let's get into a conversation. There's a lot of great expertise around the room, and I always benefit from getting the questions, because then I know what we're not communicating about what we're doing or not doing. But Steve, thank you for the invitation to be here. And for those of you here at Stanford, you have a great resource in Ambassador Steve Pfeiffer. He was really one of our foremost experts on the former Soviet space and on issues of strategic stability. Having been at our National War College, our War College students all read his articles and to figure out how did we get to where we are. And really, he also is one of those great leaders that leaves a legacy in our foreign and civil service of those trying to understand Russia and the challenge so that we can have a more effective policy. So
thank you for that, Chris. Although I'd point out that how did we get to where we are means how did we get to this really screwed up situation?
Well, yes. I didn't say it's your fault. But so Steve sort of set up a question for me of, what are the principal points of contention and what are the prospects for managing these differences and making progress where Russian interests align? So to answer that setup, if you will, what I'd like to do is sort of lay out a few observations on the policy framework. How do we see Russia and how does it fit into the global perspective? Because it really doesn't exist in and of itself. And then if you'll allow me quickly to touch on a quick review of the administration's Russia policy, because yes, in fact, we have one, we are implementing it, and I think it is designed to address some of these challenges and take advantages of these opportunities. And then to get back to kind of wrap up some of points on where those policy opportunities and challenges are for managing the differences going forward. So I've got a big map up here of select Russian malign activity, but really, when I look at the policy framework, I could just label it simply great power competition with a, you went to take the picture and it went off. It's the Russians.
Hybrid warfare.
But great power competition with a revanchist Russia. And so I think the starting point for any policy discussion of Russia is to acknowledge that Russia is a declining power. I have arguments about that even within my own team, but a power that's revanchist, revisionist, and neo-imperial. It's bent on changing the rules of the international behavior and frankly, of getting away with it. And I think this is important to keep in mind because throughout sort of our diplomatic careers, certainly, that there have been sort of two different schools. One was and I've devoted my career to this, and I was at the Atlantic Council before joining the State Department, of the view that with the right mixture of structures and foundations, we could bring Russia into and integrate it into the West, and that it would become a free market economy, and we could integrate it into the rules-based international system. The other sort of school of thought, and these are obviously big generalizations, was that it was a terminally declining giant. And if you look at sort of just demographics and economics and so forth, you could make that case, and therefore we could ignore Russia. And it wasn't something that we needed to really focus our efforts. We could engage in it transactionally, but it in and of itself didn't need to be a focus of our policy. And I think that those views finally began to change, maybe with the Georgia War in 2008, certainly by 2014 in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and even then more acutely in 2016 with Russia's attempted interference in our electoral process. Although I would argue Putin told us what he was going to do in his Munich speech in 2007. I always have my new Russia team go back and read that speech, because he told us how he saw the world and what he was going to focus on. And it's really a foundational part to understanding. So I want to look at the threat, and the map will come back up eventually here, to look at the threat more closely. Obviously, 2014, Russia's occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, and then subsequently launched and continues to implausibly deny an armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, really undermines European security and stability. It gets to the real heart of the challenge that we're dealing with. And Russia, to this day, continues to attempt to destabilize Ukraine in violation of its international norms. I would argue that Moscow's offensive is not just aimed at Ukraine and its periphery. I'd point out that if we look today, we can see Russia escalating its pressure again on Georgia and Belarus right now as it focuses on its periphery, which is a primary focus, but it doesn't end there. But rather, the Kremlin targets the United States and its allies and its partners. It sees both the American project, and I would argue the European project, as threats to its survival, and employs a whole of government effort to counter this threat. And so the examples, many of them are listed up here, sort of to try to just capture the enormity of the challenge. But the list of examples is long. Just over the past several years, the Kremlin attempted to launch a coup in Montenegro. It engaged in a covert and overt campaign to derail the Prespa agreements in North Macedonia. It's covertly aided the Catalan separatist movement, independence movement, and the Yellow Vests in France. It engages in dangerous cyber attacks, such as the NotPetya attack a couple years ago, that caused millions of dollars in damage to US and European companies. And by my count, this is just my own informal count, since 2014 alone, it has attempted to interfere or influence over 40 elections in the West. And so there's a campaign here. Another sign of Russia's challenge to the Western-led international order, and we can come back to this in our discussion, is its serial disregard for international security and arms control commitments. This includes the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which we declared Russia was in material breach of and then withdrew from last year after Russia tested, produced it, and fielded an INF violating weapon system. But it goes beyond just the INF treaty. Russia's violating the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty. Russia has undermined military transparency by its so-called suspension of the CFE Treaty. And since 1991, it has refused to declare any exercise under the Vienna document procedures. It selectively implements its Open Skies Treaty, for example, hindering flights over Kaliningrad, which is of critical security and transparency concern to both the United States and many of our allies and partners. The Kremlin's use, obviously, of a military-grade nerve agent in Salisbury and the shielding of the Assad regime indicate that Russia disregards its international legal obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. And even today, Russia's deploying over 1,000 mercenaries under the presumed cover of the Wagner private military company to foment and prolong civil war in Libya. It's likewise exacerbating tensions across Africa, and maybe we can turn to Latin America. We were just sort of having a side discussion here earlier. But the threat from Russia is not just a military one. Russia utilizes digital technologies to target us and our democratic allies from within. These include election meddling, complex, well-resourced influence operations directed at the highest levels of the Russian government. Russia doesn't discriminate along political ideology or party lines. It's really aiming to undermine democratic institutions and exacerbate the tensions that are inherent in any democratic or open society. So in short, Putin's Russia is prepared to take increasingly aggressive and dangerous risks abroad, violate its international commitments, and sow chaos and disruption in the West in order to achieve its policy goals. I'm not arguing it's some madman. It's doing this with a purpose to achieve its policy goals. And in light of the last couple of weeks and all the focus on domestic changes, I want to make one last comment here that we also need to note that Russia's aggressive foreign policy is driven in large part by insecurity, fear of internal change, and systemic weaknesses at home. Any IR theorists out there, we have to look at the internal as to understand also what's happening in the external. The regime is increasingly relying on repression to stifle dissent, as illustrated by the harsh crackdown on protests this summer in Moscow and elsewhere. And I think the polling shows that the people, Russian people, increasingly see that the regime is either incapable of addressing its domestic problems or is actually in many cases the source of those. The government is engaging in a crackdown on its own people that violates its international commitments. We've seen Russia tighten control over the internet, or at least set up the systems and legal structure to do so. It has passed a change in the law to label individuals, not just organizations, as foreign agents. There's a clampdown on human rights and NGOs. And right now they're engaged in the most serious crackdown on minority religious organizations since Soviet times. And I would point out that if you look at Memorial's statistics, one of Russia's leading human rights NGOs, there are more political prisoners now than at any time since Gorbachev. And so this pattern of repression at home, aggression against its neighbors in Central and Eastern Europe, and attacks on democratic institutions of our allies and the United States, adventurism in the Middle East and Africa and South America, all spring from this relative or at least perceived weakness and insecurity at home. And I would argue that that scenario, that tendency is likely to continue well past 2024 and whatever happens in Putin's transition process. So quickly, let me touch then on what's our policy towards Russia. Having described this threat that you see, what are we doing about it? So our Russia strategy is based on our national security strategy, takes a balanced, deliberate approach to Russia as a determined and resourceful competitor of the United States. First, I'd like to note that our Russia policy recognizes that we've returned, as I said, to a period of great power competition, with Russia and China as our primary competitors. Russia, though it's limited in its resources, is committed to challenging the United States, our values, our alliances, and the architecture that sustains them. And so our national security strategy, and then the Russia strategy that flows from that, is designed to prepare us to engage in a systematic, and I would acknowledge a long-term competition with our rival. And so as our policy would argue, it continues to be among the foremost national security interests of the United States to prevent the domination of the Eurasian landmass by hostile powers. And so the central aim of the administration's foreign policy is to prepare our nation to confront this challenge by strengthening our military, economic, and political fundamentals of American power. And I think you know from the military side some of the steps we've taken. We've increased our defense budget. We are prioritizing investments in the U.S. nuclear arsenal to maintain a robust nuclear deterrent. We've increased funding for the European Deterrence Initiative to $15 billion that enables rotation and the development of capabilities in Europe to counter and deter Russian aggression. And we've worked with NATO allies to enact the largest defense spending increase since the end of the Cold War. The second part of our policy, and I think, Steve, this really touches on how you talked about dialogue and the periods of engagement with Russia. And I don't think it gets enough attention, although I would say I spend a lot of my time on this, is that an adversarial relationship with Russia is not our desired state of relations with Russia. We're open to dialogue and even cooperation with Moscow where it is in our national interest or that of our allies. is that our president has said it would be in the U.S. interest to have a better relationship with Russia. And so to that end, and I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more as we get into discussion, but we've pursued and set up bilateral dialogues with Russia on Syria, on North Korea, on Ukraine, on Afghanistan, on Venezuela. Last year, we resumed a counterterrorism dialogue with the Russians. And just earlier this month, we resumed a strategic security dialogue with Russia to discuss the challenges to strategic security, ensure that we have clear communication and understanding of each other, and try to avoid miscalculation. But I would say we are realistic that there are limitations to this engagement. And if I were to assess, some of these engagements have been more productive than the other, but as a whole, our assessment of this engagement with Russia to date is that we find Russia seeks rather to prolong international conflicts and increasingly defines its interests by opposing U.S. interest in conflict settlement. So I would generally say that from our perspective, the ball is in Russia's court to demonstrate that it is committed to engaging constructively in these dialogues. A third pillar of our policy is that while we're open to engagement with Moscow, we've been clear that we will take every step necessary to protect our national security and that of our allies, including by raising costs to the Kremlin for its aggression and malign behavior. Above all, we've been clear that there can be no improvement in our bilateral relationship until Russia ceases its aggression in Ukraine and ends its campaign of malign interference in our internal affairs. And so this administration has taken really, I would argue, unprecedented steps to defend our interests from Russian aggression and to punish and call out Russian aggressive behavior when it takes place. Cumulatively, these actions have worked to degrade Russia's ability to conduct aggression by imposing costs on the Russian state and the oligarchs that are used to sustain it. And just a couple examples. This administration so far has sanctioned 321 individuals and entities. This includes 16 human rights abusers and 72 individuals and entities for their involvement in Russian interference in our democratic processes. One of them, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the famed internet research agency Troll Farm. He also heads the Wagner private military contractors, has been sanctioned. He's indicted. We've expanded our sanctions against his network. And a quote, I think, from the Secretary Pompeo really sums up what we're trying to do here. The U.S. government will continue to work to ensure that Prigozhin and others like him find no refuge or comfort as long as they carry out destabilizing activities that threaten the interests of the United States and its allies and partners. We're ensuring that these efforts are coordinated very closely with our European allies through synchronized expulsions of intelligence officers, the continued rollover of sanctions. I think you may have seen the EU just announced additional sanctions on Crimea, so-called Crimean officials today. And in March 2019, the United States, Canada, and the EU on the same day imposed sanctions on those involved in the Kerch incident where some Ukrainian sailors and vessels were seized. And I've heard criticism that sanctions are ineffective, that they don't work, and I think you can have a debate about the use of sanctions as a policy tool. But I would argue in the Russia context, they are having an impact. Depending on who you ask, which economists, somewhere between 1 to 2%, it's had a reduction of 1 to 2% on GDP growth on the Russian economy. We have seen where entities are sanctioned, that the value of their company has fallen by half. Our sanctions to prevent the sale of Russian military equipment has prevented over $10 billion in sales of Russian equipment. And cumulatively, this is having an effect of constraining Russia's ability to act and carry out malign activity. And so our policy remains unchanged, that we will use the steady cost imposition, including sanctions, only one of the tools, until Russia changes its course. So I'm talking too long. Let me wrap up here with some of the challenges and opportunities I see for the future. I think the Russia challenge, this map, is likely to endure. This isn't really about Putin or a personality or an individual, although it is his system. I think the key for us will be going forward to manage competition our current tasks to stabilize the relationship while we counter and deter Russian aggression and reduce risk. So some opportunities. Secretary Pompeo said last month when Foreign Minister Lavrov was in town, we should have a better relationship. I think addressing any of these challenges on the map would move us, frankly, in that direction. But I think there are three opportunities where we can manage our differences and provide some stability to the relationship, even in that overall context of a relationship that is based on competition. So the first one is Ukraine. Again, as I said, there's no improvement in the bilateral, there will be no improvement in the bilateral relationship until Russia ends its aggression. The pathway is very clear for Moscow, and we've made that our point of view very clear on that it's to implement the Minsk agreements. But I think we have a new opportunity here. We are encouraged by the positive steps that Ukrainian President Zelensky has taken to resolve the conflict, opening up border checkpoints, withdrawal, trying to de-escalate, presents an opportunity. The December 9 Normandy summit and then the subsequent prisoner exchange at least provides an opportunity to making progress on this conflict and for Russia to reverse its harmful behavior. So that's one area where I think there's a possibility to reduce the tensions and make progress and bring some stability to the relationship. But again, it really largely depends on Russian actions. Second is addressing some of these regional conflicts. If Russia chooses to engage constructively, we can build on what I would call overlapping interests in addressing some of the most difficult regional challenges. I don't mean necessarily the conflicts we think of in Russia's neighborhood of Georgia and Transnistria or Nagorno-Karabakh, but more broadly. Russia, like the United States, has experienced the real costs of international terrorism and is interested in presenting the return of ISIL. That could provide a footing for a more productive relationship, and that's a hypothesis that we're testing right now. On North Korea, both the United States and Russia are committed publicly to the final, fully verifiable denuclearization of North Korea. I would say similarly on Syria, we are both committed to the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Russia has said there is no military solution to the conflict. So there's the potential, but I would also then qualify that Russia has just launched a military campaign in Idlib that leads me to question whether there is space in that Syria context. But again, working to address some of these conflicts, even if we aren't successful, but a dialogue and working to address them could reduce tension, that could build confidence, and help create the parameters to manage competition in the bilateral relationship. And the third one, I think, is also the obvious one, strategic stability and arms control. I think this is the area where there's the greatest potential, and I would also argue the deepest challenges to managing the bilateral relationship. In fact, I was discussing yesterday or a couple days ago with a friend of mine who negotiates health contracts, and he asked, how can you do a contract with a country that violates every contract they sign? And I think that's really one of the challenges. This administration has been clear. We are eager to pursue trilateral arms control with both Russia and China. We seek, this is a statement of our policy here, but we seek arms control arrangements that are verifiable, are enforceable, and include all the partners who have the ability to impact strategic security around the world. So I think it is possible to make progress in reducing nuclear tensions with Russia and the intensity of our strategic standoff with Moscow when the circumstances of the security environment are conducive to such a movement. We hope to get back to this kind of environment. And to contribute to this, we seek a new arms control relationship with Moscow that would forestall a destabilizing global arms race that Russia's policies, and I would add China's policies, and posture today threaten to create. So the potential is there, and we have begun that dialogue, and we will test whether it's possible to make progress. So let me finish by laying out then the challenge. And I think this one is a significant one. And this is really about deterrence, not nuclear deterrence or conventional military deterrence as we used to, but a modern deterrence of deterring Russian malign behavior. If we look over the last several years, we can point to significant success and a growing cohesion at home and with our allies on addressing the Russian threat. Bulgaria just dismantled a Russian malign influence campaign, has expelled a number of Russian diplomats who are conducting a malign campaign in their country. We are making progress on this. Domestically, we have improved our resilience and our defense efforts. Our cooperation at the state and local level on election security in the run-up to the 2018 congressional elections was vastly improved over the 2016 process. And the 2020 process is learning from our mistakes in 2018. And so we are getting better at developing our approach to defend our systems. Our allies share a much more common threat assessment that this represents a threat to them as well. Even if we disagree about what's the tool to apply in response, we have an agreement on the threat. And in many cases, we're working with some of our allies and partners to improve resilience and our ability to defend ourselves against Russian malign activities. And I think these actions can help us address the impact of Russian interference, but they don't change and alter Russia's intent. If Russia persists, it will eventually be successful. And I would argue that we can't afford another Skripal type of incident or the successful changing of an electoral outcome in an allied nation through manipulation effort. And so the Russian threat is broad and it's deep, and it requires a holistic response that not only builds resilience, but also ultimately achieves deterrence to Moscow, that they cannot achieve their foreign and security policy aims by engaging in malign campaigns. And so we need to rethink through a revised concept, and I'm speaking proactively here on behalf of the government. We are in a process of thinking about how can we achieve deterrence in a world where, in a universe, a system where Russia, China, Iran, and others are engaged in malign campaigns that really don't meet traditional concepts of deterrence and engagement. How do we deter those most dangerous behaviors? And I think if we don't, then all the other efforts to stabilize the relationship, to provide stability, to manage risk and competition really will be very limited if we don't achieve deterrence against malign activities. So let me stop there and we'll turn it to questions.
Great, Chris. Well, thank you very much. I think you've covered a lot of ground and given us a lot of things to chew on. Let me start with a question that we talked about a little bit earlier this morning. And I think you're right. This is not just Vladimir Putin's policy. This is a Russian policy.
Indeed.
Although Mr. Putin is the primary actor and shaper, I'd argue. And as you made reference, a lot of the things that we see now were foreshadowed when he spoke to the Munich Security Conference back in 2007. But of course, Mr. Putin is now term limited. Under the Russian Constitution, he can no longer be president after 2024. And so the question is, what happens next? And 2 weeks ago, we got some ideas. He proposed constitutional changes, one which appears to enhance the power of the prime minister. And he did spend 4 years as prime minister, technically, when he was term limited the first time. And then also this possibility of this new state council. So how do you see this? What is he trying to do? And what does it mean for how the United States should be engaging Russia?
Yeah, what is he trying to do? Victoria Nuland, our former assistant secretary, had a witty phrase. It's a scary place to be inside Vladimir Putin's head. So what is he trying to do? I mean, we can only speculate. Look, we can only look at what he's proposed and the actions, and then we're going to have to test them over time. But I think some of the articles and commentary that this is the beginning of a transition is wildly optimistic at best. I don't think Putin's system, I don't think he can leave office even if he wants to. I would even argue in many ways over Putin's term, he has deinstitutionalized the country. If you go back to Soviet times, you could argue even in a totalitarian system, you had checks and balances. You had the Central Committee. You had the military-industrial complex, if you will. You had the army. You had the KGB. You had competing constraints that were arguing for resources, for policy priorities. In many ways, those have all been stripped away, and the vertical of power does exist. Now, it's not just one person. There is, I call it the oligarchy that sustains it. I would note in all the personnel dismissals, nobody left. Sort of the power and security structures, the siloviki all remain in place. Some lower level changes, but in principle, nothing's really changed in that regard. And so I'm not so sure that he can leave office even if he wanted to. So we're going to have to look and monitor what happens. But what I think he's setting up is a way that he retains some form of control. And we've seen periods where the control has been informal rather than a rigid, hierarchical, formalized system. I think we might see something that is more implicit. I don't think any of the new people that they put in office are likely to be independent power leaders to set off on a policy course that Putin doesn't agree with. And so I think what he set up is a scenario that he is able to manage control in the process well past 2024, regardless of who is prime minister or president, because now, frankly, neither office necessarily means anything. And so we're going to have to watch how that unfolds. And that's why I say these challenges are ones that will go past 2024. It's how do we engage those for the long term?
Great. Okay, well, let me open up to questions. If you could give us your name and affiliation, and please have a question mark at the end of your hopefully short question. Steve.
Steve Krasnick, Political Science and Exercise. So one word it's a fun-little word that never passed your lips, which is Trump. So would it make any difference if we had a different president? That's one question. Second question, I might be allowed. What do you think is constrained Russia in the Baltics, where it would seem to me an invasion would be something that it's not clear to me how we would have it. So one, would make a difference if we had a different president, and two, what about Russian policy in the Baltics?
So I'll preface the first that I'm a career Foreign Service officer. And I would argue that there's actually continuity over sort of the tail end of the Obama administration post-Ukraine and our Russia policy today. So I don't think that's really true. I don't think it would make a difference. In fact, I would argue there's broad bipartisan consensus. I spent a lot of time with our Congress. I think there's broad bipartisan consensus about the Russia challenge and that we need to do more to confront that. And so I think we have the footing for a sustained. One foreign minister asked that we have strategic continuity in our foreign policy. And I think the fundaments for that in terms of Russia policy are there. One tool might be emphasized more than another, but I think that both the opportunities and the constraints will continue to guide us. On the Baltics, it's a good question. And I don't want to jinx it by saying, and then they go charging in there. One, they are some of the most active in integrating into NATO, and we have now rotating presences there. That I think Moscow clearly understands the risk of escalation in Moscow. I don't say that they preclude it. And to sort of jump ahead, that isn't particularly why in our arms control discussions with Russia, we're very concerned about Russia's growth of non-strategic nuclear weapons, because they could alter fundamentally through their tactical use or their potential use can alter the theater fundamentally. And we don't really have a direct counter to that. And so it does raise questions, and this is what we've tried to get at. Why do you, Russia, have such systems? Why are you building them so aggressively, as we saw with the Skyfall incident in August, where it crashed, where it exploded when they tried to bring up the crashed remnants of it? What is the objective? And I think it does get to the core of your question, where do Russia's ambitions end? I think they have a more pronounced view of what's their sphere of influence in terms of Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, the Caucasus, Central Asia. But the challenge with spheres of influence is there's always another country then touching that sphere of influence that then becomes part of the sphere of influence. So I think we take the risk seriously for the Baltics, but I think we've also put in place elements that provide deterrence.
David.
David Holloway here at CSAC. So you talked about Russia's malign activities. You also mentioned, rather in passing, Russia as a declining power. And I'm wondering, what are Russia's vulnerabilities? So if you're, let me just give one thought I had. You talked about about U.S. policy not allowing great powers to dominate the Eurasian continent, landmass, right? So we have China and we have Russia. So what about Russia's relationship with China? Is that a focus of your thinking?
So the Russia-China one, so there are two elements. I think you are right. That is a major vulnerability. They have nowhere near the resources to compete with China. If you're a Russia watcher, you might have seen in the fall, Putin hosted a big summit with African leaders in Sochi. And many of the African leaders we've engaged with left wondering, for us old timers, where's the beef? There wasn't anything there. There were no commercial contracts. There were no investment contracts. Unlike a similar conference with China would have led to investment contracts and sales. We have concerns about those, but it would have been different. Moscow doesn't have the resources to compete in the way that China does. And I think Central Asia will increasingly be a point of friction. They're consciously aware of that, I believe, and are trying to manage that between themselves. But I think Russia's concerned about China's growth of nuclear weapons. There are a lot of intermediate range Chinese nuclear missiles pointed at Russia as well. So that is a vulnerability for Moscow. It also theoretically provides a potential for us to engage. But it's really difficult to figure out what's the policy tool. It's great analytically, yes, we should. But to drive a wedge between Russia and China is a lot harder said than done. That I haven't seen a good recommendation that is viable. You know, you could try to offer, okay, we'll acknowledge Russia's sphere of influence. I don't think that would work to get Russia to be more effective at countering China. I don't think we can, we don't have the ability to give Russia a sphere of influence. Those countries have a say, and Ukraine shows they're prepared to do a lot to have a say. But the China one is really interesting, and I think that's one where, because Russia is a declining power, it is acting aggressively. I'm no China expert, but we see China engaging over the long term, thinking how to, as a rising power, how to use that power for the long term, and taking less risks. In certain areas, yes, but more strategic and more careful.
We have a question that was sent in over the Wi-Fi.
Cool.
Okay, it says, you have described the basis for Cold War II. I would disagree because I think Cold War is very different, but a difficult relationship with Russia.
Without a doubt.
And my guess is that if we had your counterpart from the Bureau of East Asian Affairs, they would describe also a difficult relationship with China. I think you're correct as we can't really drive wedges, but are there things that we can do in our policy with regards to Russia that perhaps don't push them together?
Sure.
And are there limitations on how far that Russia-Chinese relationship can go?
So on the limitations, you know, neither country really has alliances. They have partnerships, and I think Russia, going back to your question, sir, is the longer that partnership continues, the more Russia looks like a colony supplying China with its resources and political heft in multilateral fora, and less like a partnership over time. But the things that we could do or not do, again, some of the things we're going to be constrained. We have to address Ukraine, we have to address malign influence. But there are areas where, you know, Arctic is a potential, where Russia's interests in the United States are not totally at odds. We have concerns about Russia's effort to militarize the Arctic, and there's the rub. But Russia's very concerned about expanding its reach into the Arctic. China has self-declared itself a near Arctic power, whatever that means. So that, again, like on the strategic security issues, where Russia starts to perceive more keenly a China challenge, they provide an opportunity we can engage. But the moment you see the opportunity, just on the other side are 3 or 4 counterweights of Russian militarization of the Arctic that you don't want to legitimize in the same process. So it doesn't provide an easy policy answer. Fair point, but how to affect that as a policy is much more complicated, and I have yet to find a good answer to that.
Tom.
Thank you. You enumerated a long list of objectives and a long list of actions. Are these prioritized in any way that facilitates trade-offs? And what are the mechanisms or the criteria used to judge their relative efficacy? That if I were to push your presentation a little hard, it sounds like our approach is more of everything. And in order to make it work,
I'm
we
greedy.
need more, as opposed to we might need fewer,
Sure.
different, in an argument with our partners.
So I would argue, I think the key is to look at it over time. Post-Ukraine, very much the initial focus was to strengthen European deterrence and security and to invest resources. It had only been a few years earlier that we celebrated the removal of the final Abrams tank. And within a year, we're trying to figure out how to get them back. And so there was a priority in post-Russian invasion of Ukraine on the hard security issues, how to reinvigorate and re-resource to counter Russian aggression. I think where we are trying to put our efforts in are both how to stabilize the relationship by reopening some channels of dialogue and test whether we can manage the competition. And I will say across the interagency, as we become more keenly aware of the malign threat, the interference in cyber, that's a newer challenge that we have to devote more resources, both intellectually to the construct, but also into the countering effort. So I don't think it's all more of the same. I think we're trying to rebalance that, both the engage in order to stabilize and manage the competition, but also to focus more on the perniciousness of the malign activities, if that makes sense in answer to your question.
Todd Stewart, retired FSO. Chris, you posited a continuation of the Putin system after 2024. Do you see some possibility further out, say 10 years, of a challenge to the system from younger generations of Russians?
So I think the regime is incredibly stable and durable, and it will be until it's not. I mean, I think there are elements of brittleness to this. While making it so rigid and strong, you also created the very elements that make it brittle and unable to adapt. And so I think we would be wrong to say that this is going to endure forever. I'm positing in the nearer term. I don't think, let's say there is a new president, there'll be a new president in 2024, and that new president and whatever prime minister, I think even if Putin disappears from the scene, that the successor's room for maneuver in that system will be much more limited. I think, though, you point out one of the challenges I didn't really mention is that we have to also engage for that future and build the people-to-people ties and the engagement with Russian society for the future, because we have values we want to continue to project and communicate. Our sanctions are not broad sweeping sanctions. They're not designed to crush the Russian economy. They're designed to be targeted. Our target is not the Russian people. And so how do we reach past that to be engaged with Russian society so when those opportunities for change happen, whatever they might be, and I don't know whether it's a challenge from within the system, do the oligarchs say, hey, this is really bad for business, enough is enough, or European economy is growing, they want to reintegrate. I think there are lots of venues. We need to be engaged for the long term so that when those opportunities for change do come, Russian society and future leaders understand our positions, understand our values, and understand how to engage with us, and therefore avoid condemning the U.S. Russia relationship to another 25 or 30 years of this.
I'm done. Okay, Phil.
So Steve Krasner asked you about Trump in a very polite way. Let me pose this a little more directly. You've got this chart up of all these malign activities, and I certainly affirm in my own view that that's the case. How do you fight that malign activity when the President of the United States in Helsinki essentially rejects the idea that the Russians have interfered in the election, says that he has to take Putin at his word, and attacks the findings of our own intelligence agencies? How do you fight this malign behavior when the President of the United States takes actions in Ukraine that seem to undermine the very policy you described?
So my answer is very simple, that our Russia policy is the president's policy. All of our sanctions, the expulsion of Russian intelligence officers, all the sanctions are briefed to the president and approved by the president. President signed the sanctions on Russia for the Skripal attack under the Chemical and Biological Weapons Act. The president has redirected resources to counter Russian malign interference ahead of the 2018 elections. He created a new executive order that helps us target malign influence and election interference. So in fact, you know, I acknowledge the point of your question, but the facts are this is his policy and we are implementing it.
But his rhetoric is not consistent with his policy.
I think the president is trying to also create that stable relationship with Russia. And if you can create that stable relationship with Russia and engage with President Putin directly, then we can hopefully make progress. President Obama did the same thing, even in the height of the Ukrainian crisis, where you had thousands dying. We engaged the Russians. And so I think we have to be careful. We don't want to not engage Russia just because we see it as an adversary or many of its actions as a direct threat to us. We want to engage Russia.
Alice?
Thanks. Hi, Alice with CSAC. In terms of that process of engagement, I wondered if you could talk about any of the cross-pollination that happens, because I know people have been kicked out, diplomats on both sides, and so on, as you know very well. So what channels are there that exist today between Russia and the U.S.? Is it just based in arms control and things like that, or are there other elements?
So we have had sort of, on the regional conflicts, we've had our envoys engaging largely through the foreign ministries, through the Russian foreign ministry. But with our counterterrorism dialogue and the strategic security dialogue, because these are broad cross-cutting threats where Russia has a very different approach in many ways. Russia accuses us of being the founders of ISIS, for example. So having a counterterrorism dialogue is a little bit challenging because the perspectives are so diametrically opposed, even when the threat is so similar that it should be easier to work. So we've tried to construct where we have senior level interagency engagement with them. And same for the strategic security dialogue, senior level interagency engagement. That way we can ensure that a broad perspective of the Russian government is hearing our concerns about Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons, for example, not just the foreign ministry. Whether that's effective at penetrating into their system, we will have to test and see. Because I think in many ways the foreign ministry isn't necessarily really the decider on Russia's foreign and security policies. That in many ways they are often a one-way transmitter. Not uniformly, but the foreign ministry certainly has its limits. And so I think that the channels are there for that. Secretary Esper has spoken with his counterpart. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs has a dialogue with his Russian counterpart. It has largely been built off of Syria deconfliction. They've got a lot of heavy machinery flying in close proximity to each other. We want to avoid incidents because they will spiral out of control. And that led to the creation of a dialogue channel meant to manage competition and avoid miscalculation. Those have been effective. It's really to test, can you then go from them to stabilize the relationship? We'll have to test it. I think, as I laid out, there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical that it can get there, but the process can be useful at preventing, at a minimum, miscalculation and avoiding risks along the way.
David Asher, community. You mentioned our relationship with our allies, but you also said something about the allies maybe using different tools than we do, or what tools to apply vis-a-vis Russia that we're not using. And are we in alignment with our allies in terms of how to move forward with our relationship with Russia?
I think large part, yes. Sanctions are a EU tool, though. No nations can impose their own sanctions. So their process is much more slow and cumbersome. But finally, Brussels has developed new authorities to sanctions for cyber attacks and for chemical weapons attacks, and have already sanctioned Russians under the chemical weapons regime. So they are building at a pace that's slower than what we would like, but they are building the capabilities to respond. They are working on a human rights sanction regime to be able to counter human rights violations. So they are building that. And so I think that overall is a positive process.
Is there a preoccupation with debating U.S. social capital and some of its sort of symbolic capital in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe? That is, and also that is also a component beyond economic and military capability. So it's not really all about winning the mind, but also the heart. And the U.S. has been quite a sort of aspirational beacon for the people of Central and Eastern Europe and the post-communist states. Has suffered some losses under the current administration. So the question is whether it's a preoccupation with that sort of informal, unmitigated effects of this administration that are also enhanced by the fact that these countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Russia as well have been going for a sort of contestation of rule of law that was previously restricted.
A preoccupation on our part or on the Russian part?
On your part, but if you can speak on Russia's behalf.
So I think Russia has thought that this is an opportunity to promote values and try to change and influence in hearts and minds. It has upheld itself as a defender of traditional values, for example, and has tried to use that to exploit divisions in Central and Eastern Europe in particular, and the Western Balkans. They have used it as an orchestrated campaign in the Western Balkans against NATO and EU integration, is don't integrate into the West or your children will become gay. I mean, they have funded campaigns specifically saying that. So I think you are correct, is that we have to go back to some of our basics of promoting our values. If you focus on national security strategy, one of the elements of a core fundamental element of a national security strategy is promotion of your values abroad. And I think that is an element that we have found we need to go back to, is that we have a positive story to tell. And sometimes that gets lost. And it is something that we are very focused on right now. We have engaged in sort of a positive messaging campaigns, for example, about old school public diplomacy that foreign service officers used to do. We have gone back to some of our basics. Rather than trying to fight Russian disinformation and sort of pull out, well, that's a lie, we have actually found that doesn't really work. Going back to promoting the positive story of U.S. values, U.S. commitment to Europe, the history of U.S. engagement in Europe has proven very effective at trying to change that dynamic around. Is it a preoccupation? No, but I think we recognize we took our hands off the handlebars or our feet off the gas pedal on something that was important because we thought we had won the hearts and minds of Europe and that debate was settled. And that was, as we saw, a false assumption, and it created space for Russia to meddle that we've had to go back and redevote some resources to.
Thanks. I wanted to go back to Alice's question for a moment on channels of dialogue, and especially with regards to what you said about trying to come up with a deterrence framework for malign influence for cyber activities. Where do you see that fitting in, especially with the difficulties in cyber and in influence operations of attribution,
right,
and deniability, and all of the splintered agencies responsible for these different campaigns within the Russian government, within our own government? Where can that conversation take place? Who needs to be at the table? Is it happening in any of the channels you've talked about today?
So some of it's government. There's also one of the things we've learned is public-private partnership in this. Facebook and Microsoft have done more to do public attribution about Russian malign activities in cyberspace than the US government has been able to do, and has been able to do it much more rapidly. So it's not just a US government activity. There's no way the US government alone can do this. But I think you really do get to the heart of the issue, that Russia's an authoritarian regime. It's very easy for them to have a whole of government approach. It is more difficult for us to have a whole of government approach when you have federal, state, and local. We can't totally command that. And we have an enormous role played by the private sector. And I think we've made progress in that area, because the goal here is to demonstrate to Moscow that those most dangerous activities will neither be successful, nor will they have plausible deniability, that they will be held accountable for them. And if we can achieve that over time, I would argue, that puts us on the path to deterring Russia from engaging in those most dangerous behaviors. Will they try to fund campaigns to win hearts and minds and use disinformation? Of course. But can we deter them from hacking and bringing down Georgia's entire information system? That would be our goal. And so that is an effort that's going to take agencies, it's going to take public-private partnership, and it's going to require Europe to do the same thing. And Europe has done a lot in terms of resilience, but the public-private partnership, they don't have that yet. So there's still work to be done. But you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of what the long-term challenge is at achieving that.
Naveen, you have a question? Oh.
Back in the old days, I worked at the State Department from 85 to 90, and back in the old days, you could kind of have sport about who was going to succeed the head of the Communist Party by standing next to you on the podium. How do you try to do that now? Is there any way to see, to read who might succeed Putin and what different
oh yes, we're dusting off all our old Kremlinology skills. The interesting thing is that while Russia has, the government has consolidated control over television and print media, the internet is an amazingly wild thing still. And there are a range of Telegram channels, for example, where a lot of people share stuff and opine, and oh, so-and-so was here and so-and-so was there. And I think you can start to develop a picture of who has relationships with whom. But in many ways, you're right. We are back to, because it's a non-transparent system, but there's some sort of change happening. And I wouldn't say it's transition. Change is not transition. And we will have to see then who is on top. I'm particularly interested in, former Deputy Prime Minister Kozak is no longer a Deputy Prime Minister. He might be in the presidential administration. But he had played a large role in the recent Ukraine negotiations and the Normandy process. So we're looking with personnel signs, is there a potential for a shift in Russia's Ukraine policy? I would argue, doing Kremlinology, there's no change yet. But you are correct.
Andrew?
I'm Andrew. I'm with CSAC and the Graduate Honors Program. In your remarks, you highlighted increasing military budgets as part of the administration's response. So I wanted to ask, given recurring federal budget deficits, how can we best compete against Russia in a financially sustainable way?
So I think that goes to really why we are interested in sort of achieving arms control and strategic stability with Russia and ultimately with China, because we want to avoid an expensive arms race. I think we have to look at getting allies to do more and take the threat seriously. Again, that's why I highlighted that they have done more and have put more resources to that. And I think it's also why we are, again, to beat the dead horse, but very focused on Russia's non-strategic nuclear weapons. Because it would otherwise, if those are not brought into an arms control and transparency process, I leave it broadly defined, then we are going to have to adapt and spend resources to counter that threat that we are not currently spending. So I think it's going to take some time to figure out what's the most effective. I think we've found some of these deployments and rotations and building up capabilities for deployed assets and so forth are very cost effective because they're not big new units, new divisions stationed in Europe, but rather lighter footprint, rapidly moving, but they achieve the deterrence effect that we're desired. And I think that's a good model to follow looking forward. But there are some issues where Russia's investing resources that we really have to look more seriously at.
Matt Uzell from Hoover. I'm a National Security Affairs Fellow there. You've talked quite a bit about deterrence, and certainly in places like the Baltics, deterrence makes sense. But in cases like their disinformation campaigns, operations in Ukraine, they're ongoing operations.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that the language of coercion, we're trying to get them to abandon things, which there's a much higher bar for that.
Correct.
I was wondering if that's something you talk about, you think about, or if you could comment on that.
So, I think, again, Russia will probably always use some form of these tools. What we need to do is to deter the most dangerous type of activities and understand that those are not cost-free, nor will they be effective at achieving their foreign policy goals, but rather their employment reduces Russian security and takes them away from achieving their foreign policy goals. Skripal is a good example, that it led to mass expulsions of Russian intelligence officers across the United States and Europe. It exposed them for not complying with their international treaty obligations. It's a good example. You're right. In Ukraine, it is easier for them to manipulate. In the former Soviet space, Russian language remains a second language. The reach of Russian television is dominant still, as a platform. So we will always face some of those challenges. But it's to target the most dangerous activities that we want them to understand, attempted coup and so forth. Those are not things you should engage in. They bear a high cost. And to achieve deterrence there, I think you're right. They will engage in efforts at coercion and manipulation to achieve their policy goal. It's to target the most dangerous activities.
Hi, I'm Bernice from the Carnegie Tsinghua Center in Beijing. So going back to China, U.S., and Russia, on the North Korea issue, do you see any potential for a trilateral cooperation, or do you think China and Russia will continue to form closer ties and support sanctions?
So you hit the nail, right? The last part is the key. I think there is potential for cooperation. Russia and China both seek gradual relaxation of sanctions, sort of in exchange for empty air promises not to do things. And it's very clear that's not how this administration is going to pursue that. We've tried that in the past and it didn't work. And so we're trying a different approach. I think the key, Russia has cooperated in the UN. It has been a productive working relationship. We've really invested a lot in talking with Russia about our engagement with the North Koreans directly, giving them briefings on what we're saying, what we're trying to achieve, our pathway, so that they have an understanding. I think the challenge in particular with Russia is sanctions enforcement. North Korean laborers, Russia was one of the biggest locations, and mysteriously now there are 20,000 North Korean students in Russia right after the time period ends when all North Korean laborers are supposed to leave. So it goes back to the core of we are committed to engaging in dialogue, but in practice, there's not necessarily a demonstration of Russian resolve to reciprocate and to follow through. So again, we will just continue to test and see where they go, but I think sanctions is the key where we are very clear with Moscow that we expect better enforcement, and that's the test for us for engagement with Russia.
Back there.
Hello, you mentioned, Una, I'm visiting research here at Center for State Studies here. You mentioned Georgia. Right now, with the Turkish president talking about the fact that Georgia needs to accede and expressing support, two questions. Do you think Georgia's succession to NATO is realistic? And second of all, what risks are you preparing to withstand in terms of Russia's reaction if that happens? Thank you.
So, we have the Bucharest ministerial decision that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. I think Georgia still has a lot of work to do to get itself on that path. It's certainly demonstrated that it's a capable partner from the military side, but there are domestic reform issues that I think really need to be addressed. But it's important for both Russia, for Ukraine and Georgia, that pathway is open because it is the pathway to encourage really necessary reforms. I think the issue of Russia using aggression to forestall that, I don't think it's just related to NATO or even EU, deeper Georgia-EU relations. The moment you had the Normandy process, right from the Normandy summit in December, there was an uptick in violence in Georgia. You had increasing efforts to move the borders in South Ossetia. A very high-profile case of a Georgian doctor being kidnapped. And then you had a massive, and right before that, you had a massive cyber attack directed by Russia against Georgia that brought down the entire telecommunications infrastructure of the country. So Russia is always prepared. There are no frozen conflicts. They turn the dial up, they turn the dial down as need be. And I don't think that will change one bit. I think Russia will continue to exert its control or attempt to exert control over Georgia.
There's going to be an NPT review conference in a couple of months. And I assume that there will be lots of criticism at that conference of the U.S. withdrawal of the JCPOA with Iran. What is the administration's position going to be with respect to that kind of criticism when it comes up at the meeting?
So I can't speak to I can't speak to the JCPOA component, but one of the outcomes from our recent strategic security dialogue with the Russians is that we are actually going to try to work on a joint statement on a title to be determined, but about avoiding nuclear war, whether it's a P5, N5 joint statement or whether it's a U.S. Russia statement, I don't really know, but it's something we agreed to work on with Russia as a potential deliverable ahead of the NPT RevCon. And so I think we will have to see. Yes, there'll be criticism, but I would also say on some of the other arms control issues, NATO is in full support on the withdrawal from INF and on a range of Russia's other violations of its international commitments. So I think Russia will also come under its own fair amount of criticism.
My name's Bob Shaw. I'm a resident of the community, comfortably retired. My question would be about Poland and Hungary and what's happened there and whether you see Russia as having had influence or potentially having influence in those two particular countries.
So not with respect to Poland, but definitely, with Hungary, we have some concerns. Prime Minister Orban has deepened ties to the Kremlin and has really developed a deeper relationship. It is objecting to further NATO-Ukraine cooperation over concerns about Ukraine's language law and has really not engaged with Ukraine to solve this dispute. The Hungarian parliament approved Russia moving an old Cold War Comintern bank, the International Investment Bank, and having it move from Moscow to Budapest and giving it diplomatic immunity. So there are things that we are concerned about in that relationship. And I note that it begins to change. Hungary and Russia sign an agreement on building these nuclear power plants. Many years later, no power plant built, but other behaviors start to change. It points to Russia's malign use of energy as a political weapon and as a weapon of corruption. And so Hungary is one we're definitely concerned about. And it goes back to the question, though, of competing for influence and presenting a positive agenda. So sort of recognizing that challenge, what we've tried to do is re-engage with Hungary and point out the risks of engagement with Russia, and then our shared commitment to values and Hungary as a viable, as a robust member of NATO and of the EU and the partnership that we have, and trying to compete for hearts and minds to shift that balance.
Hey, ask you about the Russia-Turkey relationship, where you had two countries
Yes.
which traditionally have had very conflicting relations. You saw this warming trend under Erdogan. It then came crashing down briefly after the Turks shot down the Russian fighter. But then it recovered fairly quickly. So, Turkey's now bought S-400 Russian surface-to-air missile systems. But now we have Turkey talking about sending troops into Libya to fight Wagner. So where's that relationship going? I mean, it really seems to have a certain volatility to its nature.
I think that would be a good way to describe it. I mean, I think, perhaps each side is using the other to achieve their own objectives. I don't think there's a true partnership, and I think that's really one of the challenges we have in countering Russia's overtures towards Turkey. We need to not do Moscow's job and split the NATO alliance. Turkey is an important NATO ally. It is a key partner in all of NATO's infrastructure and everything we do. And we need to preserve that alliance and not do Moscow's job for it of trying to split the alliance. Going back to the Baltic question, it's always assumed that might split the alliance. A Russian invasion, and you have countries that say, well, we're not risking ourselves for that. We don't want to turn Turkey into a similar scenario. We want to manage these differences and preserve the alliance partnership. But Libya is one where their relationship is very much on the surface at odds. I would also say on Ukraine, Turkey has been a very strong, clear voice on, and you know that well, there are historic, cultural, ethnic ties on Crimea, and Turkey has been a strong voice on not accepting what Russia has done on Ukraine. And that hasn't changed one bit at all in all this. So I think that's one very much case by case, and you have to look at each circumstance for what it is.
I'd like you to put yourself in Russia's shoes and ask, what does Russia really want, valuable to them, that we would be willing to lose somewhat, give up at much less cost?
So I think the first challenge is to speak of Russia. And I think let's separate Russia and sort of Kremlin, the regime, because I think their interests are different. Russia's interest, if we were to look at them, would be economic prosperity for its people, growth, security in its traditional sense. I think the Kremlin views that differently. That's preservation of the regime, preservation of its assets, its ability to control and influence and leverage power. And so I think those are different interests, and that really then creates the challenge of which one do we engage with to offer something. So I think it is possible that, how do you offer a security guarantee? I'll give you an example of what the Russians have proposed. They want a mutual non-interference pledge, and they bring up the old Soviet era mutual non-interference pledge signed under the Roosevelt administration that the Soviet Union abrogated the very next day by saying it didn't apply to the Communist Party of the United States and they were free to fund the Communist Party. So how do you engage, how do you offer a deal that is even viable over time with a country that doesn't honor its international commitments? Again, I'll go back to that I think it is possible in strategic security. Russia has things it's concerned about. It is concerned about U.S. and NATO troop deployments. It is concerned about U.S. ballistic missile defense. So are there areas, is there trade space in that to reduce the tensions and create managed competition? I think that's definitely possible.
So I'd like to build on the last question and ask it in a little bit of a different form. If we were in Moscow right now and this talk was on U.S. malign activity around the world, what would appear on this map from their perspective?
Sure. I think it would be heavily a big Russia, and they would accuse us of funding opposition, of undermining their values, of trying to topple the regime, of fomenting colored revolutions around the world. I mean, they believe that. You know, I will say, they believe their propaganda that we've started ISIS. There's a challenge with their propaganda. The more they repeat it, the more they actually start to believe it and forget that they actually started it as a disinformation campaign themselves. And it really factors into the system, and then it takes on a life of its own. You know, that's really one of the challenges, is that they do believe sort of fortress Russia besieged by enemies. Yes, it is. The Kremlin wants that narrative because it's useful for them for domestic and for external political purposes. But there's an element that believes that, believes the conspiracies, that we fomented the Rose Revolution and the Orange Revolution and Kyrgyzstan and everything else. I mean, the story today is that we are the originators of this virus in China. That we did this, and in fact, we designed it to target certain races on purpose. That's coming right out of Russian state media today. So I think they believe that. The challenge is, when we're not doing any of those things, how do you disprove that and move past that? Dialogue and transparency can help. But when there's that deep-seated paranoid belief, it's a real challenge to move past that.
In your capacity, how much are you influenced by a change in administration? For example, the executive branch of the government, are they influencing you or directing you? Can you respond to that?
So, I mean, every administration sets its policy, and at the beginning of this administration, we went through a robust review of the existing effort on Russia, and then how to redesign that. I think, and that would be true under any administration, sets the course. I think the national security lays out a very good construct for dealing with both Russia and China, and that's the policy that we're carrying out. So, you know, is there undue political influence, if that's the impression of the question? Then that's just not true. In fact, I think we've got good leadership to address the challenge. We've opened the dialogue, and we've imposed the cost so that Moscow knows we're serious. And it's now time to let those mechanisms take root and continue on. And I would suspect, whatever happens in 2020, that there will be continuity in the general framework of dealing with Russia.
Yeah, I would just second that. In the 27 years that I had in the Foreign Service, whether you were going from a Republican administration to a Democratic administration, or a Democratic administration to a Republican administration, the changes in foreign policy tended to be less dramatic than you would expect on a lot of questions. And I think you've seen, you know, there's actually, if you go back for the last 25 years, a pretty significant degree of continuity in U.S. approach towards Russia. Any questions? If not, I have, okay.
I'm looking at the map of malign activity and hearing Russia is a declining power. But I look at this and our need to play whack-a-mole with each most dangerous one, and as it becomes, I mean, you talk about Russia being stable until suddenly it won't be. Well, some of these are like the least dangerous ones until suddenly they are, and then we have to go after them. If a declining power is able to put us in a reactionary mode with regard to our foreign policy stuff full time, how does that signal that's a declining power?
Look, I think in many ways, many of these activities, Moscow has been able to do either because of U.S. inattention, lack of leadership, we didn't perceive the threat, we weren't prepared for it, or it has done so at very low cost. Russian malign activity across Africa, very low cost. Deploying private military contractors, very low cost. It's illegal to talk about the deaths in Russia. So when they get blown up, nobody knows it happened. Where in our system, it would be the front page of all the newspapers, we would have a policy review, we would have a congressional hearing. In their system, they can carry it out with very low cost and very low domestic risk. So in many ways, their system, Moscow's system, enables it to take risks abroad with very low cost at home. So these aren't, and many of these are not really expensive activities, both for Russia to carry out or for us to counter. They require a concerted whole of government effort and allies and partners that enable us to counter, rather than that we have to whack-a-mole and chase them around the world. This is not some giant that is all powerful. They have been very deft at exploiting opportunities. We should give them less opportunities and then use the tools and resources necessary to counter them.
Tom?
Having twice been a DAS and twice been an assistant secretary, I recognize the agency responsibilities of the role. But I trust you've got priorities, perspective of your role. What do you think we could do to most enhance the efficacy of what we are trying to do vis-a-vis Russia?
So, and I think that's what I ended with. To me, the biggest challenge remains countering the malign campaign and convincing Moscow not to engage in the most dangerous activities. Because I do think we have been reactionary and whack-a-mole. I think we're adapting that. And I really don't think we have achieved deterrence yet with Moscow in that regard. That's the biggest challenge to me, is a deterrence concept for malign activity. And I would argue this is actor agnostic. It doesn't really matter whether it's Russia or China or Iran. We need a model that achieves deterrence in this space because it's one of the new threats that we have to deal with for foreign and security policy. And it's one we haven't been as well designed. We are better designed to deal with in terms of agency, of actions and tools and capabilities. But the construct and how to achieve, actually get the message of deterrence to the actor, I don't know that we've done that yet. I just don't know that we've done that yet. We're trying. And to go back to your question about the president raised it with Lavrov, and the secretary raised it with Lavrov. We've been very, very clear with the Russians. We're not saying the change in behavior that one would expect when you have laid out costs and potential and risks and demonstrated our readiness to carry through on imposing those costs. I haven't seen that change in behavior yet, and that's why I'm concerned that this is this area that needs more attention.
Last question here.
Your map doesn't have any arrows pointing at Canada or Australia.
No, actually the Canadians they have almost the same identical Russia policy as us. We have a very good partnership there. They have the same poor state of bilateral relations. We are very constrained. And the Australians have led an effort on countering disinformation, sort of an actor agnostic approach. They see a more imminent China threat, but they have experienced the Russia threat as well, and are trying to also pull together international partnerships to counter this. So I think they're both there. It was they're very critical partners in countering this. And again, I would say Canada's Russia policy is nearly identical to ours.
But is Russia mucking with their election mechanisms as much as it is with ours?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think the Canadians have found influence operations directed against them, but I don't know if it has been election targeted or not. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, well, I think our time has run out. Please join me in thanking Christopher.
Thank you.